All right, let's begin. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me today. So imagine you've built an application or a website, and your code is amazing. There are no bugs, no errors. Everything works perfectly. But then there is your front-end design or interface, and maybe your users don't really seem to trust it that well. And you might be wondering, why is this happening? What can I do to make it better? So this is exactly what I'm going to talk about today. So we'll explore different user experience design principles that you can use for your front-end design to actually build that instant trust and confidence with your users. But before we begin, I want to play a game with you. 1 second. I'll show you a series of different interfaces, and I want you to raise your hand if you trust the interface that you see. Because I know it's a bit late today, it's almost end of the day of the conference, you might be a bit tired, so let's just get a bit more energized. All right? Yes? Okay, so the first interface, do you trust it? If yes, raise your hand. All right, I see 50-50, getting a bit more. Maybe you also know the product that you see. That's also possible. What about this interface? Do you trust this? I see no hands. No one? No. Well, that's actually a real website I found last week when searching for some examples. And this one, do you trust it? Yeah, I see some. Maybe you also recognize it. So maybe you've noticed that in all of these 3 examples that I just showed you, you were rather fast to make your decision on whether you trust the interface or not. And that's not a surprising thing, because research also found that user interface impressions are formed as fast as just in 1/10 of a second. And just think about it for a moment. 1/10 of a second. It's such a short period of time. It's either actually you build a trust or break it with your users. So everything from the functionality to visual aesthetics, design, everything matters. So I like to think about user impressions the same way as we meet new people for the first time. So maybe you already met someone today or yesterday at a conference, and you immediately have that first impression about the person that you see. You immediately analyze how the person is behaving. Is he or she nice to you? Are this person actually approachable? Are they smart? And the same happens with interfaces. We actually make this judgment very fast. So in today's talk, to be more specific, we're going to focus on 3 main blocks. So the first one is how you build that first impression with user-centric design. Then also how you can use visual design and accessibility to build trust even further with your users. And finally, we'll also talk about dark patterns. So what are they, why you should avoid them, and what you can actually do better instead. So before we begin, I want to quickly share a few words about myself. So I'm Tetiana Gulei. I'm originally from Ukraine, but for the last 11 years, I live in the Netherlands. So I started my career as an embedded software engineer, so I've been in the tech world as well. And I actually later transferred to UX design. So right now, basically, my job is to make sure that interfaces are accessible, user-friendly, and intuitive. And all that knowledge that I take from my work, I also share on LinkedIn Learning, because I'm also an instructor there. I record different courses. I'll also share with you links later in this presentation, so you can scan a QR code and connect with me if you want to. So the idea for this talk, it actually came to me not just from the theoretical knowledge, but actually from my practical experience. Because as a designer, I have to collaborate daily with multiple development teams. And what I noticed in that collaboration is that it's very common for development to focus on technical aspects, functionality, and it's also a very common thing to think that UX, UI, building trust is something that is solely designers' responsibility. But I actually disagree with that, because developers play a key role in that as well. So in that collaboration, it actually goes both ways. So if designers understand technical aspects and not design something crazy that developers think, oh my God, I will never build that. And the same way as developers understand the basic principles of design, user goals, and business goals, together we can actually build something that not just works well, that it just functions, but something that builds trust and loyalty with our users. So trust for companies and for business means a lot. And first of all, it's better user retention. Because if users have this trust feeling, if they're satisfied with the product they see, it matches their needs, their goals, they keep coming back and actually reusing your product, which actually grows your user base. Then, of course, trust means less support tickets, because users don't complain about some bugs or some bad functionality that they don't understand. And if there are actually less support tickets, it means there's less development rework. So instead of really focusing on bugs fixing and so on, you can really focus your time on building valuable features that meet user needs. Also nowadays, what I see in the industry, that earning trust of our users is very difficult. It's actually challenging if you think about it. Because users are even more cautious nowadays about their time and about their money, where they spend it online. So basically, that leads me to that important question: how to make that strong, positive impression with your users? Because also nowadays, we have a lot of online frauds and scams, and even though if your product actually is legit, if you have good intentions, if you actually really want to help users solve their needs, if there is no instant connection, if there is no trust factor, they will just close your application, close your website, and move on to the next thing. So to begin, let's actually talk about understanding the users. How many of you even know for whom they build the features in the end of the day? Not just from the technical perspective, but from the business perspective, from the user goals. When we know for whom we really build something with every line of code, we actually try to focus on our users instead, not just on the technical aspects. So that leads me to the very important term that is called user-centric design. And this is something that is very common for UX design industry, because that means that we place users at the center of design and development process. So not our own assumptions, not what our manager wants us to do, not our technical thoughts about it, but actually what the user wants to achieve. So user-centric design has this very straightforward design process. And it consists usually of 5 main stages. And it's very simple to comprehend, because with every stage you can also move back and forward and iterate your product until you actually meet those user goals. So the first one is research. This is when we try to empathize with our target audience. So who they are, what they do, and so on. Usually, if you are a designer, you would just go and have some interviews, send out some surveys, try to learn more about your users. But I can imagine that as a developer, you have lots of different tasks to do. And actually, that knowledge already exists in your company. Most likely, support or sales or marketing, they already have a lot of data about your users. So you can always reach out and find out about the audience that you are doing your work for. So then, when you actually have that understanding, that empathy, we move on to the concept stage. And this is when we actually brainstorm some ideas. It can be either individually or collaboratively with a whiteboard or sticky notes. We just think about all the possibilities that we can build together. Then when it's concrete, we go to the design phase. And usually if you have a design team, they will just come up with some low fidelity and high fidelity designs that later as a developer you can build. And finally, we have the last stage, which is testing. And testing is not just for QA engineers, it's actually testing with our users, whether what we build is user-friendly, whether it actually meets their needs. So you see it's a linear process, and then after testing you go back to research, but actually in reality you always have to go back and forward. So from concept to design or from concept back to research, you have to be very flexible in that process. So first of all, defining who you build this for. always ask yourself questions. Who are our users? What age group do they belong to? Where do they live? What is their daily routine? Where do they work? Also, what do they do? What are their habits and so on? Just actually imagine the person that stands in front of you who would use your product. Then also think how they use it. Do they use it on a mobile phone because they are on the go, like they are in a rush, they're going to work? Or are they just in a quiet place? They have a nice desktop on their table. Is their operational system, is it fast? Is it up to date? Or do they have a very slow system that actually doesn't process your application well? And the most important question is why? Why do they do it? Why they chose your product, not competitors? Why is it actually interesting for them to use it and not something else? So another way to empathize with your users, besides having all of that research, is actually using the product by yourself. And not actually as a person who works on it on a daily basis, but actually from the fresh eyes, from the fresh perspective, with that beginner's mindset. And if you have that kind of approach, when you have that critical thinking towards whether a product makes sense, you can learn a lot about what you do on a daily basis. And also, of course, try to collaborate with UX and UI designers if you can. I'm actually curious, how many of you have a design team with whom you work on a daily basis? Okay, some of you. I see some hands, that's great. If you have the chance, I really encourage you to do that even more. Not just actually waiting for them coming to you and sending you the files, but actually even asking them, challenging them, why do we design it the way that we do? What do we try to achieve? What is the business value behind it? And if you don't have designers in your company, you can actually just learn more about UX design principles. I also hope that this presentation will be helpful by the end of this session. So if we have that user centricity, that kind of mindset in our head, we actually start to think about usability. And usability is something that has to be a foundation of every product. Because if our product is not intuitive, it's not usable, then nobody will want to use it. So to define usability, just to have it as a term, it's actually the ease with which users can achieve their goals with the help of your interface. So for example, we all know online calendars. And just think about it for a second. Why would you use this kind of tool? What do you try to achieve? So for me, it's always like, I want to create an event. I want to have a reminder of an event. I want to see all the events for the following week. This is something as a user I want to do. And then you can actually see whether you can achieve those goals or not. So when we talk about usability in the UX design world, we often also refer to 10 usability heuristics. Have you ever guys heard about this before? Raise your hand if you did. I see someone? Great. So usability heuristics is actually rules and guidelines for good design. And in the industry, they are actually seen as the best design practices to follow. So every designer, if you ask them, they actually know what it is. I will share with you a few of them that I find very important to use in my daily work. We will not cover all of them because it's too much. For today, I also want to share about some other aspects of good design. But let's start with the first one. So the first one is actually matching between system and real world. And that means that your interface has to use human language and visuals that are really understandable for users. Not just something like exception, error, of code doesn't comply or something like that, but really something that who actually doesn't understand the programming language can really get it. So again, to give you a good example about calendar. So we have calendar on our phone, or for example, in our laptop. And have you ever even wondered why it looks the way it looks like? It actually really matches the real physical printed out calendar. It's because all of the alignment of days of weeks, month, and so on is really familiar to us. And as users, we don't have to relearn it from scratch. It would be crazy, actually, if we would have to think and learn how to use a calendar. It's actually very obvious because it matches something in the real life. Then we have also online maps. And they also look exactly the same as physical maps. You can actually see the streets, the places, you can find them, you can actually navigate as well. And this is another example of the system that matches our real world, because we are used to it. We are used to it in our real life. The next heuristic that is very useful is also efficiency of use. And that means that your interface needs to help your users achieve their goals as fast as possible. And it's very important because users are impatient. If it takes for them more than 2 or 3 seconds to load something, they will just close it, move on, and so on, because impatience actually leads to frustration. And if you actually cause those kind of emotions, it breaks trust with your users. Very common when our system is slow or it takes like quite some time to upload, we have a spinner that says, okay, it's loading, it's coming. But if it takes more than this few seconds or a few minutes, then nobody's going to wait for that. So of course you can give feedback to your user that it's coming, it's loading, it's going to be there, but actually also more important to optimize the system, make sure that performance is better. Then we also have user control and freedom. And that means that your interface gives your users the way to recover and take a step back. Because as users, we want to feel in control. We want to have that feeling. We don't like to have just a black box and not knowing what is happening at the moment. So to give you a practical example, the first one is actually a freedom to go back. So this is a web shop I designed recently. And as you can see, on every step, there are 5 different steps. And I actually placed the return button so to let user navigate back in their journey. But in the same way, I also made the progress bar interactive, so the user can click on any step at any given time and actually have that flexibility to go back and forward. But if you do this kind of approach, if you give that flexibility, it's also important to make sure that the data between all that switching around is not lost, because it can be also quite confusing for users to fill in everything about their details, about their address, and then actually not having it saved. Another way to give that control is actually to have an undo action. That one happens with toast messages that we see nowadays, especially on the desktop. The toast message can appear on the top of your screen or on the bottom left or right corner, and it actually gives you feedback of what just happened. And actually, for critical actions like deleting something or sending a message, maybe you actually did it by mistake, maybe you did not intend to do that. So with the toast message, if you have those buttons that let users undo their action, it actually speeds up their workflow and actually makes them feel more trusted towards your system. The next heuristic and the final one for today I want to cover is actually error prevention. So instead of letting users have these errors, you prevent them from making mistakes by giving helpful constraints. And that could be, for example, disabling some buttons or giving error messages before proceeding to the next stage, everything that makes them actually feel in control and not having to make that mistake. So for example, if, again, there is a critical action that something's going to be permanently deleted, just have a validation pop-up with a very basic sentence, "Are you sure?" Because these are the consequences. You cannot recover. This is very important. And then, of course, you give the confirmation button, like, OK, delete, I want to do that, or cancel, just, no, I want to go back in my journey. And this is actually the moment for your users to take a pause, think about the action, and ask themselves, hey, do I actually want to do that? Or is it something that I didn't intend to do? This is very important, because if you prevent users from making mistakes, they actually feel safer using your system, because it's reliable. And let's talk also about making those errors. And very often, we tend to build very bad error messages. Even as designers, sometimes we struggle with text to make it really user-friendly. So the first very bad example of a bad error message is the one that is written by robots. For example, that top example, exception processing message. Nobody has any idea what it means. This is not helpful. The user has no idea what to do. OK, they can click on try again, but most likely they'll get the same error again. So then also another bad error message is vague one and also ambiguous. Something like, oops, something went wrong. Very typical one, but it's also not helpful. Because, yeah, it doesn't give any guidance. It doesn't give any reference of what to do. And also, even worse one is the message that blames users, like, do not do this. You're wrong, with the exclamation mark. This one also exists. So please don't do that. Save these tips for later. We have to actually strive for better error messages. And to give you an example, it's something that is actually written for humans. So if you build error messages, ask yourself, okay, what has gone wrong? How can you fix it? How can user recover from that? And in that way, try to write that message in a normal human language, just explaining briefly with a humble tone of what went wrong. So it's very important to be helpful and actually show the users that you try to empathize with their mistakes and that you actually want them to fix them. I encourage you to read about other heuristics principles. They are very important. They are at this official website, nngroup.com. I will also share a QR code with all of the helpful resources at the end of this presentation. This kind of resource will also be there. It's very important because if you work with designers, they know about them all. But I feel that as a developer, it's also very interesting to be aware about those principles. All right? So we just talked about usability. This is more about functionality. But it's also very important to pay attention to our visual aesthetics, to our visual design. Because even if you make your usability excellent, but your visuals are not that impressive, then actually it will also not bring trustworthy feelings to your users. It was also found by research that users tend to accept some small mistakes in your system if they like the way your interface looks like. And this is quite interesting to think about it, because we always think usability is the core thing to focus on, but actually visual aesthetics matter as well. And that kind of phenomenon that I'm talking about, it's called aesthetic usability effect. And that means that aesthetically pleasing designs, they are often viewed as easier to use. So that is also important to remember, that you have to spend some time on making sure that the way your application or your website looks like is actually nice. So to be more specific, what you can do. First of all, try to give that simplicity for your users. We often tend to overcomplicate our designs, our user interfaces with a lot of unnecessary objects in it. But actually, think about core features and core functionality that you want your users to use. Like in this example, if you look at it, it's very simple. It's very clear that the goal here is for the user to start a free trial. So what we have here in this UI is just a headline, a sub-headline, and actually a call to action. And to support that call to action, in this design, we also see some case studies, some social proof that brings that confidence to the users. But nothing more and nothing less. And this is quite a simple design, and it's very easy to know what to do here. When it comes to simplicity, I also like to talk about Hicks' law. And this is also very interesting because it means that the time it takes for user to make a decision increases significantly with the complexity and number of choices. So for example, we all know these pricing pages where we see different plans of software we want to maybe try out or to purchase. And very often we see 5 or 6 different plans. And actually, it's so much choice we have to go through. We have to read every plan, think about what it means, what is the benefit. So if we only had, for example, 2 or 3 plans, then it would make it way easier and faster for user to make a decision. But to actually, even if you still have a lot of choices like different pricing plans, what you can do is actually to give some visual cue, like most popular. It's very common nowadays to give that guidance to the user to proceed to the best decision that they see. Also, Hicks' law applies to overwhelming interfaces. And this is another pure example that is quite classical, that too much information on one screen will make it confusing and will break trust with users. So on this example, this is a real software. I'm not joking as well. So if you think about it, where do you actually start? There are so many drop-downs, check marks, buttons. It's very unclear. For the user, my cognitive load is very high. It's actually maximized, so I do not know where to begin with. But also with dashboards. is so common because we want to show a lot of data, a lot of graphs and numbers on our dashboard. But it's actually way easier to have just a simple beginner's view and then let the user personalize their experience and actually complicate it if they want to do so. Because you have advanced users who want to see that. But then you very often have beginners users who see your dashboard for the first time and they don't want this complicated thing. They just want to start easy. They want to actually have this learning curve to get to that level. So if you work with dashboards, try to also minimize it. Don't put 5 or 10 graphs in one screen. It's too much. All right. So simplicity also comes with visual consistency. And this is something when you have unified patterns, colors, fonts, and other UI elements. So this is an example of what not to do. If you, for example, have a button that is different on every page, on every screen, that is not consistent. And consistency actually confuses users because the lack of consistency confuses users because they have to relearn how this element works. If you have different color or even different font or different CSS properties like rounded corners, borderline, and so on. So if you have, for example, a button and it has this blue color, certain font, make sure that you reuse it on every page and on every screen. Then another very nice rule that I love to follow as a designer is 60-30-10 rule. And this is actually used to achieve that visual consistency and harmony. So what it means is that 60% of your screen is a primary color, then 30% of the screen is a secondary color, and only 10% is an accent color that you use for buttons, important call to actions, maybe some icons, and so on. So to give you an example, here maybe you do not really see on the screen, but the primary color is white. Then in the navigation, you have the light gray color, and only for buttons and icons and some infographics, you have this blue accents. So you don't have this rainbow of different colors here. It's very easy to follow. It's very easy to understand what to do in this certain interface. So another way to achieve that design consistency is actually to use design systems. How many of you work with design systems? OK, so quite some. That's great. So for the ones who don't know, design systems is a collection of reusable components, patterns, and design guidelines that you use in your product. And why it's great is because you actually have that system, like a library of all the UI elements that you can later just grab them, drag and drop, and reuse in all of your platform. So a lot of teams are often hesitant to use design systems because it takes a lot of time, investment, and effort in the beginning. So designers have to be involved. Also, developers have to set everything up. But actually, for the long term, it can really speed up your development work. So I really encourage you to look into design systems. There are also a lot of libraries that already support that, so you don't really have to do it from scratch. It actually makes your software, makes your product way more consistent in visual look and also in its functionality. So, of course, we just talked about aesthetics, but let's not forget about making our interfaces accessible. And accessibility means that your interface can be used by different groups of users independently from their abilities or disabilities. And this is an essential core trust element, because if you make your design, your interface inclusive, you actually show to your users that you care. And when actually users see that you care, they tend to trust your system more. So some basics of accessibility for your interface to actually consider to implement if you didn't do it yet is, first of all, keyboard navigation. So let your users navigate with keyboard, not only with the mouse. Then provide alternative text option for all images so that it can be read by screen readers. Then, of course, color contrast. It's a very basic thing, but a lot of products do not meet color contrast, especially when it tends to go about text and also backgrounds that we see. So for example, we have a very flashy red text and dark mode on the background. Just make sure that it meets the standards to make sure it's actually readable. And finally, accessible media. So if you use videos on your website, for example, or in your product, make sure there are captions. because sometimes users cannot even maybe hear it because they just watch your website in a busy environment, maybe in a public transport, or just also for users who have those kind of hearing limitations. So accessibility also matters when we talk about situational limitations. So this is something what is temporary and context dependent. So for example, I want to watch my phone, want to read something on it, but it's very sunny outside. And then I do not really see anything, so I cannot really read that news article because the contrast is not optimized. And also, for example, if I commute to my work, I'm bored, I want to watch a video, I want to learn something, but then I realize that my headphones broke, or I just forgot them, and I cannot really hear anything that is in this video. But if there are captions, I can actually read them and just use the website, use the product to meet my goals. So let's not also forget about situational limitations that we as just users can experience on a daily basis. All right? So the next important point to build trust with your users is actually to borrow it from others with the help of social proof or case studies. So social proofs is, of course, reviews, some kind of feedback that we receive from our users that we are proud of, that we can actually place on our website and convince next users, next clients to actually start using our product. So if you have that social proof, if you have reviews that you want to embed on your website, make sure that you place them in a strategical place. So first of all, it can be a homepage with a separate section where you just have 2 or 3 reviews that you just quickly show the benefits of your product. Then, of course, you can place it on a product page, and it's very much more relevant for online web shops, for e-commerce websites, when the user wants to buy something, but first of all, they want to actually read other reviews, other testimonials from other people. And of course, before the important call to action. So for example, if you want the user to start a free trial, you can also place 1 testimonial before the free trial button. This also gives way more bigger confidence for users to get convinced to actually perform this certain action. So if you work with reviews, make sure you also describe specific experiences. So not something like great service, but actually ask your users to give something more concrete, real benefits that your tool or service gives, because then it's more believable, it's more trustworthy. Then, of course, include real name and real photo. Of course, name and the role of a person and a company is also enough, but sometimes if you put actually a portrait, a picture, it gives way more personal touch. It actually makes it more convincing. And finally, I really discourage you writing fake reviews, because nowadays it's very easy. We can just type something, we can ask ChatGPT to do it for us. But users actually learned how to spot fake reviews. It's actually in a way that they have over-positively language, they are vague, they are not really concrete, they are short. So don't do that, because in the long term, it actually will damage your brand reputation. And talking about fake, we will actually proceed slowly to the last important part of this presentation about dark patterns. Why you should actually avoid them. Sometimes you may even work for the industry of a business that basically relies on dark patterns to increase sales, leads, and so on. But I want to bring that awareness of what actually dark patterns are and why it's important not to use them. So first of all, dark patterns, they are deceptive tactics that manipulate users into unwanted actions. When actually your design forces your users to click on something, either it's to sign up for newsletters or to purchase something they didn't intend to do. So dark patterns, they're a very bad thing to use, and first of all, it's actually because you might have short-term gains, such as bigger sales or meeting your goals or actually having more leads, more newsletter readers. But for long term, it will really damage your brand reputation. When users realize that they got into a trap of dark patterns, they feel manipulated. And nobody likes to feel that way. We don't like that feeling that we actually did something we didn't intend to do, that we got tricked. So when users feel manipulated, they will most likely also request refunds if they purchase something they didn't intend to do, or actually complain and give bad review that you cannot actually use as a social proof for your interface. So you cannot borrow trust from others anymore. So I'm going to show you a few examples of very common dark patterns nowadays that we see in many products. So the first one is hidden costs. This is very typical when you make some purchase online and you have an unexpected charge in the end. So, for example, I was planning to book some place to stay for a weekend, and I saw that first the price was 127 euros per night. Then I click on this property and I think, oh, suddenly the price is 89 euros. That's great, it's actually cheaper. Maybe there's some promo happening. And on this kind of emotions and being more in a rush because I really want to choose something, I want to be done with it, I continue and I actually tend to overpay 50 euros more than initially I had to do because there are some hidden fees, extra charges. And of course, you can read them, you can calculate them manually and think, hey, this price doesn't actually make sense anymore. But very often, users are in a rush, they don't pay attention, and very often they tend to overpay. Or they realize later that they overpay, and then they try to contact customer support and actually have a refund or have a complaint. Another example is forced continuity. And this is something when it's very easy to get into, but very hard to cancel. It's very common for free trials. We say, hey, it's free, but let us know your credit card details or your PayPal, and then you get charged afterwards. So for example, for me, I recently wanted to redo my resume, and I was quite lazy to design from scratch. So I found this tool, and I thought, OK, I'll just use their template. And it was only like $2, like very cheap. So I thought, sure, let's do it. But then in the benefits, there is something that said automatically renewed in 7 days. I didn't, of course, read that list, because who would do that? When there is so much text, people usually don't read it. Also, you can see that that was not highlighted in bold font. It's actually quite invisible if you think about it. So a week later, I was charged an extra fee, which was $25, the original price. And I really had to think, where did it come from? So I had to really search in the history and understand who charged me. So this is when I felt very much manipulated, because I thought I just paid something very cheap, very quick, and that's it. But then 7 days later, I had to pay full price. And actually, it was very difficult to find that cancel membership button to actually stop this service. So if you have this kind of behavior in your platform, I discourage you to do this. Because, of course, you get more revenue, you get more value for your business, but your users don't feel actually that trust. And the third very common dark pattern is misdirection. Maybe many of you recognize this interface. It's very common, for example, for airlines or hotel booking websites. Something when you try to actually book and you want to be cheap, you just want to save money, but then they keep actually trying to upgrade you, to actually click you on these extra plans to buy extra things like extra luggage or extra insurance. If you look at it from design point of view, you can see that the basic, the cheapest plan is very much invisible. It's a plain button with the outline. It's not very much readable. But in comparison, if you look at the regular or plus plans, they have these bright colors, blue or yellow. It immediately grabs your attention. And also those kind of visual cues like best value for your trip is something that makes us think that we will make the best choice. And sometimes maybe it is the best choice, but for many users, it's not really a thing. Then I still went with the basic plan as an example, but then I still kept getting these pop-ups like, hey, upgrade, like many times. And it was very annoying. And I, of course, still use the service because it's cheap. But still, I had to really think a lot, because I had to think where to click, not to add these extra things that I don't want to have. Also, you can notice the language they use. Like regular is ideal for your trip. It's amazing. And you think, wow, maybe it's really ideal for me. And the same here with the buttons. You see that it's a prominent color. It really grabs your attention. So if you also want to misdirect users, it's a very bad idea because it doesn't actually bring that trust feeling to them. So what you can do instead, as a designer, I always say we have to focus on ethical design. And what ethical design means is, first of all, that we don't use dark patterns, but also, more importantly, that we build transparent interfaces. And transparent interfaces mean that we show all up-to-date information, everything relevant for users to know beforehand. So for example, if you want to buy something, you show all the fees. So for example, initial fee for the first year, then for the second year, and for the third year, and so on. Also show the prices with taxes and without taxes. Make it very clear. If you have extra costs like shipping costs or other fees, also let the users know beforehand, not at the last step of their purchasing journey. It's very important. And of course, all the policies, all the information that is important to know is very actually essential to communicate it beforehand. So also privacy policy in terms is quite a standard nowadays. Every website, every product has to have those pages to let the users know what they can expect. And I know that nobody really reads them. But what actually happens nowadays is when you try to sign up for an account or purchase something, there are these checkboxes that I agree with terms and conditions and I agree with privacy policy. And many products, they actually pre-select those checkboxes. And this is something you don't really have to do because you need to let the user have that freedom of choosing whether they want to accept your terms or not. So don't pre-select that, let them read it, provide those hyperlinks, just make sure it's transparent. Of course, cookies policy, now we have all these pop-ups and banners on the websites that we let the users know that we value their privacy. Also make sure that you have clear call to actions because very often it's not the case. It's very confusing to know whether you can accept everything or you can accept just some terms and reject others and so on. Also make sure that you provide hyperlinks for users to read more. And people don't really do it, but some users really want to know how you collect and process their data. And also, nowadays we tend to collect a lot of data. And sometimes we even collect too much. So try to ask yourself of whether everything that you collect with your software is something that your business needs. Because very often we just collect a lot of things that are not valuable for marketing, not valuable for other teams, and we just want this data because everyone does so. If you can do this, minimize data collection, but if you cannot, just actually communicate clearly and transparently why you use it, why you collect it, how you're going to use it, and actually give your users the opportunity to change their settings and preference in the future. So all that being said, I would say that with every line of code, with every feature that you build for your product, it's your chance to create the interfaces for user well-being. And that means that your users feel safe, that they feel actually trusted to use your product that actually meets their goals and needs. So to recap the session, again, focus on these main points in your interface. Usability. Make sure that you have this user-centric mindset, that you focus on heuristic principles, that your website or application is intuitive and user-friendly. Also, think about other user experience laws that you can find, that you can read about them, learn about them, and be aware. Then, of course, transparency that we just talked about. All the updated information is essential. Let your users know every kind of policy, charges that they can expect beforehand. Of course, consistency. We talked about visual consistency, making sure that, for example, your UI elements are the same across your product. But it actually makes sense to not only focus on visual consistency, but also on a functional consistency. So for example, if you have a navigation that is located on one place and your hover state is just a different background fill, it should be the same on different pages, not other way around. And finally, accessibility, of course. It's a very essential topic nowadays. It also becomes as a legal requirement in many countries. So we need to pay more attention and actually invest our time in making our interface accessible. And finally, of course, if you have a chance, test your product, not just on bugs, on errors, but with real users, or maybe just with other people in your company, like consultants or sales, or just anyone that you see, like say, hey, can you please see what I built? Does it make sense to you? Especially if you don't have a design team to do that for you. It's very important in that way that you keep your product user-centric and not just focus more on functionality and technical aspects. So thank you so much. You can access more resources and these slides via this QR code. And yeah, thank you. If you have any questions, you can ask them or find me later after this talk. Thank you.